Reach Young Adult Ministry Sermons online from Tuesday, December 3rd, 2019 by Philip Jackson, pastor to young adults at Evergreen Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma, from the series 1 Samuel, entitled End of the Road, from 1 Samuel 28 and 31.
So we're going to look at the death of King Saul tonight. So we're going to be at 1 Samuel chapter 28. It's where we're going to start. And then we're going to move into chapter 31. So we started out this journey of 1 Samuel. We looked at, so we're coming out of the season of the prophets. The last prophet is a man named Samuel, who is born to Hannah and Elkanah, and he is a black and white, this is God's way, this is not God's way type of guy. And then Israel decides they want a king along the way after playing games. And God says, okay, I'll give you a king, but that doesn't mean that you get to abdicate your responsibility for being faithful. And so God begins to show them what it means to have a king. And so we've seen Saul, who becomes the king. He is a man driven by his own fear, and he's insecure, and he tries his best to make things safe for himself, but the tighter he holds on to his own power, the looser of a grasp he actually has. And so the last couple chapters of 1 Samuel actually happen, if you imagine like a movie where you have like the culminating scenes at the end where you have the battle happening, and then in another part of the story you have something else happening exactly at the same time. So a little context here. So remember, David is hanging out with the Philistines. He's hiding with the Philistines. And so they decide they're going to go to war with Israel. So David says, sure, let's do this. And so they get prepared for war. The Philistines on one side, the Israelites on the other side, and David is ready to go to battle with the Philistines on their side. So the generals, remember, they get together and like, we can't have this guy with us because he's a spy. He's going to turn on us in the middle of the battle. We can't trust him. And so they kick David out. David goes back to where they've been staying, and he realizes that his town has been raided, and the children and their families are gone, as well as their livestock. And so David goes and pursues them, and he gets all of their things back, and he is restored. Well, while that's all of that's happening, you have a couple of other things going on. So Saul, we've seen what happens at the Philistine camp. They're getting ready for war. David is getting ready for war. Well, in the Israelite camp, something else is happening. So Saul is freaking out because as he's progressively turned his back on God over and over and over again, what he realizes is that he has no confidence left at all. Remember, there was a story where David was running away, and he went and hid with the prophets, a guy named Ahijah. And he went and he hid with him, and he ate the showbread in the tabernacle. But then Saul responded by slaughtering all of the priests of the Lord, 85 men, and the entire town. So Saul has continued to divide himself on the wrong side of history. And so he's running out of options. So check this out. This is, so we'll start reading in chapter 28. There's a little bit here about David, but then it gets into the meat of what happens with Saul. So verse 1, it says, at that time the Philistines gathered their military units into one army to fight against Israel. So Achish said to David, you know, of course, that you and your men must march out in the army with me. David replied to Achish, good, you will find out what your servant can do. So Achish said to David, very well, I will appoint you as my permanent bodyguard. By this time Samuel had died, and all Israel had mourned for him and buried him in Ramah, his city, and Saul had removed the mediums and spiritists from the land. The Philistines gathered and camped at Shunem, so Saul gathered all Israel, and they camped at Gilboa. When Saul saw the Philistine camp, he was afraid, and his heart pounded. He inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him in dreams or by the Urim or by the prophets. Okay, so the first thing I want you to see here, there's a natural progression of what happens when we disobey. The first thing I want you to see is that disobedience leads to fear. So Samuel's gone, and so if you can imagine, put on your God goggles, look in your sanctified imagination, you can imagine, okay, so the last time Samuel talked to Saul was when he rebelled against what God told him to do by going to war against the Amalekites. Right? God gave Saul a command, go, I want you to wipe this people off the face of the earth, because they are an abomination to me. Because they were doing things like sacrificing their newly born children to the god Baal, things like that. So God gave Saul the job of going and wiping his people out because they had exhausted God's grace. So Saul, in his own insecurity, he says, well, the people, they want to save all the good stuff for themselves, and so he spares some of their lives. And they take all the best livestock and all the best plunder from their raiding party. So Samuel rolls up and he says, well, Saul, hold on a second. What is this? I hear animals. Everything should be dead. And Saul kind of blows it off like, well, I tried to wait for you, but you were kind of late. And, besides, this is an offering to the Lord. We're saving all the good stuff to be an offering to the Lord. We're not doing it for ourselves. And in that moment, in 1 Samuel 15, Samuel looks at Saul and he says, to obey is better than sacrifice. It doesn't matter what you have prepared to give the Lord. You've been disobedient. And so Samuel, in that moment, he tells Saul in front of the entire nation of Israel, God is going to tear the kingdom of Israel out of your hands, and he's going to give it to somebody else. And so Saul, in his response, so fast forward a couple of years later, David's on the run, he slaughters all the priests of the Lord. So Samuel hasn't talked to Saul for years. And so Saul is completely without any help whatsoever spiritually. He's burned all of his bridges. He's isolated himself from God's people. He has literally worked against what God wanted. So he's got no options left, and so he's afraid. See, there's an underlying thing here that we got to understand. If God brings ultimate confidence and security, if God brings confidence to know that we are doing what we were created to do, if he brings absolute understanding and peace, that means that without him, all of the contrary are true also. That means that without God, there can be no peace. That means without God, there can be no confidence. Without God, there is no perspective. Without God, there is no understanding. And so what Saul is actually experiencing is a godless life. The Apostle Paul describes this in Romans chapter 1. He says that God's revelation to the world, to human beings, is self-evident. But if you choose to live your life contrary to what God has said and what he has called, trying to get your attention to come to him and find confidence, to find peace, to find security, to find understanding and purpose, God will give you what you are wanting, and that is a convictionless life. But the problem is that without conviction, without the presence of God in your life, there is no security. There is no confidence. So Saul finds himself in his camp, and he's terrified. He's terrified because he doesn't know what to do, because he literally has no fixed point to hold on to. Separation from God is the most terrifying thing that a person can experience. Alone, we are weak and susceptible to any attack Satan can throw at us. There is no confidence when we rebel against God. Disobedience to God is nothing short of idolatry. The practice of taking a holy, all-powerful God down from his rightful place of authority and replacing him with ourselves. Because Saul disobeyed, he got exactly what he asked for, an unchallenged authority to be king of Israel. And it was terrifying for him. We want influence in our lives. We want to matter. We want to have a purpose. But if you remove godly confidence out of your life, what happens is you are left with yourself. It is all up to you. And deep down, we know that we are not enough. And so when God gives that, whenever he pulls himself back from us and he doesn't give us his influence anymore, it is terrifying. Disobedience leads to fear. Because deep down we know that we are not God. Saul is desperate. But not only does disobedience lead to fear, but the next thing is fear leads to bad decisions. So check out what Saul does next. Verse 7. It says, Saul then said to his servants, now hold on a second, let me pause here for a second. So in an effort to try to make things look right, when Samuel left Saul, he outlawed all mediums and paranormal people according to God's law in Deuteronomy and Leviticus, it was against God's law to communicate with the dead. That has been a long-standing practice within the disciplines of the faith, is that God knows that we are ill-equipped to deal with the spiritual realm on our own. And so part of the old law was that it was against what God commanded to try to summon people back from the dead. Because we are not God. We don't dabble in God things. Any power that we have comes through him, right? We are human beings. And so Saul, trying to throw a bone to the public and trying to show himself to be a godly man, he outlaws mediums and necromancers. And so what happens is he's kind of in a tough spot because he's about to go to war. He has no confidence. He has no idea what is actually going to happen. So check this out. Look what he does. So God's not speaking to him. Verse 7 of chapter 28. Saul then said to his servants, "Find me a woman who is a medium, so I can go consult her." His servants replied, "There is a woman at Endor who is a medium." Saul disguised himself by putting on different clothes and set out with 2 of his men. They came to the woman at night, and Saul said, "Consult a spirit for me. Bring up for me the one I tell you." Okay, so Saul disguises himself. He goes out under the cover of darkness of night, and he decides he's going to try to sneak in and try to, if God's not going to speak to him, he's going to go find somebody that will speak to him. So this is a capital offense. If you do this in Israel, you will die. So there's a whole other sermon here about people in power who think that they're above the law, but we're not going to go there tonight. Verse 9, but the woman said to him, you surely know what Saul has done, how he has cut off the mediums and spiritists from the land. Why are you setting a trap for me to get me killed? Then Saul swore to her by the Lord, as surely as the Lord lives, no punishment will come to you from this. It's ironic that he swears by the Lord that nothing's going to happen to her, and yet nothing in his life indicates that he's actually a follower of the Lord. Verse 11, who is it that you want me to bring up for you? The woman asked. Bring up Samuel for me, he answered. When the woman saw Samuel, she screamed, and then she asked Saul, why did you deceive me? You are Saul. But the king said to her, don't be afraid. What do you see? I see a spirit form coming up out of the earth, the woman answered. Then Saul asked her, what does he look like? An old man is coming up, she replied. He's wearing a robe. Then Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he knelt low with his face to the ground and paid homage. Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? Samuel asked Saul. I'm in serious trouble, replied Saul. The Philistines are fighting against me, and God has turned away from me. He doesn't answer me anymore, either through the prophets or in dreams, so I've called on you to tell me what I should do. Samuel answered, since the Lord has turned away from you and has become your enemy, why are you asking me? The Lord has done exactly what he said through me. The Lord has torn the kingship out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David. You did not obey the Lord and did not carry out his burning anger against Amalek. Therefore, the Lord has done this to you today. The Lord will also hand Israel over to the Philistines along with you. Tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. In the Lord's hand. Verse 19. Tomorrow you and your sons will be with me, and the Lord will hand Israel's army over to the Philistines. Saul knows that he doesn't have what it takes to defeat the Philistines, so what does he do? He does whatever it takes to get an answer, to find security, even to the point of defying God's law, what God has said. So he sneaks away under cover of darkness. He disguises himself to go break God's law to try to get some answers from God's prophet. What's interesting to me is that this medium, I don't think that she was used to actually spirits coming up during her seances. Because when Samuel actually comes up, she freaks out. There were no parlor tricks, there was no magic, there was no illusions. She was dumbfounded and terrified. And so Saul, what's interesting is that sin makes us do 2 things. Number 1, it makes us disguise ourselves so we won't be noticed, so we can work in secret. Saul covered his face. He put a hood over his face, his normal entourage of soldiers, of his bodyguard. Instead, he takes 2 guys with him. So number one, he disguises himself so he can't be noticed. And number two, it makes us do things that we wouldn't normally do. It makes us pretend that we're something that we're not. I don't know if you've had this experience or not. You do something that you know is wrong. So instead of owning it and coming clean and confessing and making things right, what you do is you just kind of pretend it didn't happen. Or you disguise yourself or disguise the situation and say, oh, well, that person did this, therefore I'm justified in what I did. One of the things that I've learned over the last year in ministry is that the key question is not why did you do something? Because why is full of any kind of excuse whatsoever. You say why, you can come up with 10 million reasons why you did something. The truth is that you will give an account for what you did. So Saul, he says, well, I'm doing this, why? Because God isn't talking to me. Because God is being mean to me, because God is punishing me, because God is this, because God is that, because David did this, because Samuel did this, because whatever. Not what did you do? You disobeyed what God said, you weren't obedient, and then you turned on God's people and you killed his prophets. And you've continually hunted the man that God put in your care to teach him to be a king. God isn't punishing you because of something that he wants to do. He's making you live the consequences of your actions. Sin is a terrible thing. This is really, really hard. This is a really hard thing for us to consider, because if you think about the position that Saul is in, he is desperate for a fixed point to hold on to. See, when we disobey, it leads to bad decisions. And what Satan loves to do is he loves to get us in a place where we compromise what we believe, we compromise what we say that we believe, so that then he can make us afraid. What I realize is that there's two tracks that we can go on, okay, when we sin. The first track is fear. Fear is rooted in the base idea that I'm in control. Because if I'm in control, then I can fail. And if I can fail, that means that everything is up to me. So what happens is Satan uses fear as a great motivator. There's a reason why the Bible is full of verses that talk about taking thoughts captive and transforming your mind and being disciplined about what you put in your head, about making sure that you guard your heart with all diligence, making sure that you protect what comes into your head. Fear is a great motivator. This is where Saul is. But the problem on the other track is pride. Because if we're not careful, pride tells us, I don't need to make this right because I'm justified in what I did. Because these other people, even God, did these things. And we're back to why. Sin leads to bad decisions. Fear leads to bad decisions. This is too much for Saul to bear. He can't take it anymore. He is terrified about what's going to happen. Look at what happens next. Verse 20. Immediately Saul fell flat on the ground and was terrified by Samuel's words and was also weak because he had not eaten anything all day and all night. The woman came over to Saul, and she saw that he was terrified and said to him, Look, your servant has obeyed you. I took my life in my hands and did what you told me to do. Now please listen to your servant. Let me set some food in front of you. Eat it, and it will give you strength so you can go on your way. He refused, saying, I won't eat. But when his servant and the woman urged him, he listened to them, and he got up off the ground and sat on the bed. The woman had a fatted calf at her house, and she quickly slaughtered it. She also took flour and kneaded it and baked unleavened bread. She served it to Saul and to his servants, and they ate. Afterward, they got up and left that night. See, one of the things that's really difficult about when we're in a vulnerable position is that even people that don't have the right perspective can see that we're hurting. But we are so bound up in our pride that we won't acknowledge it. Saul is desperate for answers. He's desperate to know what's going on. He's desperate to know what in the world to do to fix the situation. And yet this woman, who is literally a demon worshiper, can see that things aren't right with Saul. So she's moved with compassion on him. She says, dude, you just, let me get you some food. Can I make you a sandwich? Right? Even she can see, Saul, something's not right with you. Sin has a way of just crushing us. It takes us in just one little piece at a time. We go down this track, and then we realize when it's too late that there is no hope. See, that's the most amazing part about the gospel, is that no matter how far you go in that direction, forgiveness is still there. It's still available. It doesn't excuse us from the consequences of our actions, but grace is still there. So all this comes to fruition. Flip over to chapter 31. So not only does fear lead to bad decisions, but it also, fear leads to death. So Saul is so overcome he can't move, right? He is petrified at the idea that he is out of control. And so finally, after he eats some food, he gets up and he makes enough strength to go back to his camp. And this is where things are going to go down. So he wakes up this morning. I want you to think about this in your sanctified imagination. He wakes up this morning and he knows he's going to die. He knows that all of the years of being a king, being the top dog, everything is going to come to an end today. And he's devastated. I don't think he probably slept a whole lot that night. So he wakes up and he lines up with his troops. He's got his sons next to him in line. And they're ready to go to battle. And he knows that not only is it going to cost him his life, but his sons are going to die too. I wonder what that morning was like while they were eating their breakfast. While he was sitting at the table, probably no appetite, watching his sons eat, getting ready for battle, talking about how the Lord was going to show up and he was going to save everyone. And Saul just sits there, staring at his plate and listening to his sons. Verse 1. The Philistines fought against Israel, and Israel's men fled from them and were killed at Mount Gilboa. The Philistines pursued Saul and his sons and killed his sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. When the battle intensified against Saul, the archers found him and severely wounded him. Then Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through with it, or these uncircumcised men will come and run me through and torture me." But his armor-bearer would not do it because he was terrified. Then Saul took his sword and fell on it. When his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he fell on his own sword and died with him. So that day Saul died together with his 3 sons, his armor-bearer, and all his men. When the men of Israel on the other side of the valley and on the other side of the Jordan saw that Israel's men had fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned the cities and fled. So the Philistines came and settled in them. Here's the thing about fear and the idea that somehow in our sin we're isolated. We're isolated from the consequences of our actions. Is that fear is contagious. I don't know if you guys have noticed that. Fear is contagious. And what happens is someone makes a compromise who is close to someone else, and they become afraid. And as life turns up the heat on that person, the person that's next to them, just by proximity, they get afraid as well. Saul turns to his armor-bearer. He is terrified. And he asks his armor-bearer, I can almost imagine that Saul is thinking about Samson, one of the judges of their history. You guys remember how Samson died? That the Philistines, these same people, they put him in shackles, and they gouged his eyes out, and they put him in the temple of Dagon, and they ridiculed him. They held a dinner party, and there he was, chained up, right by the buffet table. And they would laugh, and they would snicker, and they would tease him. I wonder if Saul was thinking about Samson, thinking, what are these Philistines going to do to me? Who knows? So he tells his armor bearer out of fear, he says, take my life, kill me. Kill me now, I can't take it. I can't take the ridicule, I can't take the embarrassment, I can't take the consequences of my actions. And his armor bearer says, no, he's petrified, he can't respond. So Saul kills himself, and his armor bearer kills himself. And not only that, we forget that in our sin that people are watching us. Because we're so overwhelmed by our fear that we're blind to the rest of the world. And what ends up happening is that as failures come and as the consequences of our actions come to fruition, other people watch it happen. Look what happened in verse 7. When the men of Israel on the other side of the valley and the other side of the Jordan saw that Israel's men had fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned the cities and fled. So the Philistines came and settled in them. They left their homes. Not only did fear transfer itself to his armor bearer, but it transferred itself to the rest of the nation of Israel. People were terrified. And they weren't terrified because of anything that happened. They were terrified because their king rebelled against God. See, your influence in this world, your influence with your friends, your influence with your community is not limited to just you. So as we make decisions for our lives and as we make compromises for our life, what happens is that affects other people. So you guys know 2 months ago I broke my right hand, right? Okay. Did that have an impact on the rest of my body? Well, I couldn't lift anything heavy, right? So it affected my ability to go exercise and to work out and keep myself strong. See, we have this idea somehow that we kind of exist in isolation, and that if whatever we do doesn't really matter because it's just us. We're only affecting us. But the truth is that if a part of your body gets infected, your whole body gets infected. This is what happens with fear. This is what happens with sin. The beautiful thing about being part of a community like this is that when things happen, when infection happens, when sin happens, the body responds to help heal. But what happens whenever we refuse to let the body respond and help us heal is that we affect the whole body. There are issues happening right now all across this church with people who are making choices that are hurting others, and they can't see past their fear. See, a mature believer is one that actually turns to their problems, turns to the challenges that they face, and they know that they should be running towards their community and not against it. Because God has designed a body to work together. Look what happens next. Verse 8. The dust is settled, the battle is over, the Philistines come out of their newly acquired condos in the city. Verse 8, it says, the next day when the Philistines came to strip the slain, they found Saul and his 3 sons dead on Mount Gilboa. They cut off Saul's head, stripped off his armor, and sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to spread the good news in the temples of their idols and among the people. Then they put his armor in the temple of the Ashtoreths and hung his body on the wall of Bethshan. When the residents of Jabesh Gilead heard that the Philistines had done to Saul, all their brave men set out, journeyed all night, and retrieved the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Bethshan. When they arrived at Jabesh, they burned the bodies there. Afterward, they took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree in Jabesh and fasted 7 days. You guys remember the story of when the Philistines got their hands on the Ark of the Covenant? They took it to the temple of Dagon, right? So in 1 and 2 Chronicles actually are parallel books, history books to 1 and 2 Samuel and 1 and 2 Kings. And in 1 Chronicle 10, it says that they took Saul's skull, they took his head, and they put it in the temple of Dagon. Same place that they put the Ark of the Covenant as a trophy. It was a testament that Dagon was more powerful than the God of the Hebrews. when we are living in our sin, we're afraid. Okay? We isolate ourselves from godly people and from God's influence. And as we isolate ourselves, what happens is we step away from God, and then we begin to blame God for the bad things that are happening in our lives. Like somehow He's responsible for us doing ungodly things. But the one thing that we don't realize the whole time that we're going through things is that we are a trophy. You are a trophy. And what Satan wants to do is he wants to crush you little by little in your fear. He wants to crush you little by little in violating your conscience. And once he has crushed the life out of you, he wants to tear you to pieces, and he wants to put your head up as a trophy. And now, it's not just about you and the person next to you. It's not just about you and your armor bearer. It's not just about you and the city across the river. Now it's about the entire people that you represent. It says that he sent messengers all over the land to the places of their idols and their temples, their places of worship, to tell the story of how Baal and Dagon and Ashtoreth are more powerful than Yahweh. Saul was a trophy. Ashtoreth, these are the same gods that the Amalekites were worshiping when they would take a newborn child and throw it in a fire. This is like the epitome of offensive to a holy God. God puts people in positions of influence every day. Saul's greatest failure wasn't that he failed the people or even that he was fearful. It was that he rejected God's authority over his life. As he moved further away from the source of his influence, he became more insecure and paranoid. The story of Saul tells us that God is the one who provides influence through humble submission. He resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. He raises the influence of those who he knows will reflect his glory. So what does all this mean? The story of Saul, the story of the 1 Samuel. We've been talking about how humility, how God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. He lifts the humble up. There's a thread of humility all the way through this book. We spent the last 16 weeks in 1 Samuel. I know it seems like a lifetime. But there is a truth here that we have to remember. So you guys are starting your careers. You are starting to pay back your student loans that seem humongous. You're entering into the workforce and you're starting your life. I want you to understand that God resists the proud. This isn't a theoretical idea. This isn't some philosophical idea that is separate from reality. This is the truth. If you can be anything, be humble. Because that's where grace is found, is in humility. This is the roadmap of what pride gives you. That disobedience leads to fear, and then fear leads to bad decisions, and bad decisions lead to death. You are being hunted every day. That's why it is so important to be part of a family of believers that will hold you accountable to a godly life. And when there's an offense, you know what? We come alongside somebody in Galatians chapter 6, beginning of Galatians chapter 6, and he says, those who are spiritual, go and grab that person who has fallen to sin and gently bring them back into the family. He says, be careful. Make sure that you don't fall to the same sin. But then he says, don't be deceived. Don't think that what you do doesn't matter. Don't think that the way that you think doesn't matter. Don't think that the life that you live doesn't matter, or how you act at work compared to how you act when you're at church doesn't matter, or how you act in the private moments of your life doesn't matter. He says, don't be deceived. God is not mocked. Whatever a man sows, he will also reap. If he sows unto the flesh, he will of the flesh reap corruption. But if he sows unto the Spirit, he will of the Spirit reap everlasting life. This is the pursuit of humility. In John chapter 3, Jesus says that there's two kinds of people in the world. There are those who love to live in the light because their deeds can be clearly seen. Because they understand that if their deeds are clearly seen, that they can be used to bring them humble. But the other type of person is one that likes to hide in the dark because they are afraid. They're afraid of what other people are going to think. But the truth is that all of us are hidden. We hide ourselves in our fear, and we think that nobody else is thinking the same thing or going through the same thing. But the truth is that if we just talk to each other, we'd realize that we're all on the same page. I want to encourage you. Seek humility. It is so countercultural. Seek humility and know that that's where godliness is found. You can't do this by yourself. Because if you try to, the end of that is just what Saul went through. You realize that there is no confidence and there is fear. God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. So we're in a time of transition for the year, right? We've got Christmas coming up in a couple of weeks. And the New Year's coming. The turn of the decade. Got some weddings on the horizon, which is going to be exciting. Chad is so pumped about that. We got new seasons coming. We got all kinds of things happening. And I'm really excited about next year. So when we get back after the first of the year, we're going to have fun. We're going to do parties and do all that stuff for the next couple of weeks. But the first Tuesday after we get back, after the first of the year, I'm going to lay out for you what I really believe God has shown me for the direction of Reach and what that looks like for us in our community. And I am really excited to see what God is going to do, because I think that God has done something here that is that is going to be big. I really do. So I want you to put that on your calendar. The first Tuesday in January, be here right after the first of the year. It's going to be a great time. We're going to fellowship. We'll lay out what the next year is going to look like. Okay.
What's up, everybody? This is Philip Jackson, pastor to young adults at Evergreen Church. I want to invite you to come to Reach. We meet every Tuesday evening at 6:30 at Evergreen Church, just east of Mingo on 111th Street. For more information, check out our website, reachtulsa.org. You can connect with us on social media and on Instagram by searching for reach.tulsa. Also, be sure to subscribe to our content for the latest sermons and updates. You can also find us on Spotify, iTunes, and wherever you find your favorite podcasts.
Yeah,